Good afternoon, everybody, and you're all very welcome to this afternoon's discussion. I'm going to pause for a moment, have a bit of feedback. Now, that's better. Apologies for that. As I say, you're very, very welcome to this afternoon's discussion. And our topic today is, can using social media influence your views on politics and how you vote? Specifically, we're going to be discussing the finds from the recently commissioned report, Understanding the Influence of Online Technologies on Political Behaviour and Decision Making. This report was issued by the Joint Research Committee at the European Commission. We've got two speakers on our panels today. We have Professor Stefan Lewandowski, and he is from the University of Bristol, and he's the coordinating lead author of the report. We also have Professor Jane Suitor, who is from the School of Communications at Dublin City University. She's also the director of the Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. So, you may not realise it, but in the last 5 minutes or so that it took you to log into this meeting and to listen to this introduction, there have been about 20 million Google searches, 6.5 million Facebook logins, lots and lots of snaps, chats, 23.5 million videos viewed on YouTube. Need I go on? There's a lot of posting, swiping, tweeting, scrolling, etc. going on all the time online. So the question is, what does it all mean? Who controls that data? What are they doing with it? And by what authority are they doing things with it? This report explores all of that in detail. It was commissioned to highlight the importance of understanding the influence of online technologies on political behaviour and decision making. Can you give us some of the background to this, please, Stephen? And by the way, you're both very welcome today.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. The background to this, the wider background to this, is that democracy all over the world is in retreat. There has been evidence from a number of sources for the last 5 or 10 years that should make us concerned, because in many countries, democracy scores have been declining, including in Europe. And so, as a consequence of that, the European Commission started this research project several years ago, trying to understand, how do people work politically? What is the psychology and sociology and philosophy of people in a democracy? And the particular report that I had the privilege of being involved in was addressing the relationship between technology, online, and democracy, because it turns out when we look at things at the online architecture that there is a number of pressure points between the way the online ecosystem works and the way people think. Human cognition is challenged in a variety of ways by what is happening online, with adverse consequences for democracy. So we were seeking to understand those problems and maybe suggest solutions.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. You mentioned 4 pressure points at risk, I suppose, as social media consumers in a democracy. I'd like to look in more detail at those 4 pressure points. What I'd like you to do is, I suppose, for my benefit and everybody else, is that there's quite a lot of, I suppose, terminology in the report. So maybe to simplify the language for us, to help us understand, what we're dealing with. Let's say there's 4 areas. There's the attention economy, choice architectures, there's reference to algorithmic content curation, and then misinformation and disinformation. So, Stephen, I'm going to ask you first. Can you talk a bit about the pressure points around attention economy?
Sure. Well, the basic problem is that whenever you go online and you're using social media or a lot of other platforms, your attention is a commodity. It is being monetized by the platforms, and they're basically selling your attention to advertisers. I mean, the only reason Facebook exists is to make money from your attention. And that has consequences, because if you look at human attention and what we know about human attention, then it turns out that people like to attend to things that are emotive, that are evoking outrage. And even though we may not want to acknowledge it, people like to look at negative bad things online and in the newspapers. Bad news sells and outrageous events sell. Now, if you know that about human attention and you then have an economy that is marketing people's attention, and the only goal is to capture attention, well, then you have a recipe for an ecosystem in which the only thing that matters about information is whether it attracts attention, not whether it is accurate or valuable. And I think that's a fundamental thing we need to understand about the online environment, because that tells us why we're observing all that misinformation and disinformation and fake news that's out there now. Because a lot of things that are false and that I make up are novel and attention seeking and arousing. You know, all the qualities that trigger our attention are embodied in misinformation. And that sets the stage for a big problem for democracy.
Okay, so just picking up on the points you made there, I mean, you're very clear on how all the different social media channels are continually vying for our attention. And you also referenced misinformation, I suppose, which is another way perhaps of saying that when we are being fed more controversial or taller stories or darker stories, they get more attention. So we'll come back to that later when we're talking about information and misinformation. I'd like to move on now to the another pressure point mentioned in the report, choice architectures, architectures, I beg your pardon. Jane, can you explain a bit about what that actually means and what the implications are? Thanks.
Yeah, so the choice architectures are just basically how do the tech companies design their platforms? How do they design their advertising models to get your attention? So, you know, as Stephen says, what they want to do is to keep you looking at a story, looking at your news feed, coming back to it, liking things on Facebook, sharing things, because the more time you spend there, then the more they can charge an advertiser for your time being there. So the choice architectures, what do they have? What decisions have they made about how their platform works that's going to keep your attention? So, of course, what they've done is they've made choices in it that if you find one thing negative, they'll feed another one to you. So, if you see something on YouTube and you keep watching to the end, then the next thing you see on YouTube will be even scarier, or it'll, you know, make you even crosser. So they'll keep monitoring what is there for you and keep feeding you more and more of that because they see it's what's keeping your attention there. So if you're there on Facebook and there's a story that makes you mad, so you're just really cross, the government is so incompetent, or it makes you scared, you know, you're starting to believe those conspiracy theories about COVID. So you're there and you're scared, and so therefore you're sharing these stories to your parents, or your grandparents are sharing them to their kids because they're worried about their grandchildren. This kind of, then what the choice architecture will do is just keep feeding you more and more of this. So the madder or sadder or more scared they can get you, then the more they will feed you this. And it's that choice architecture. So basically, it's just a way of saying, what are the design choices in this big ad model, in this big attention economy thing that they're all making their billions out of? How is it that they're monetizing? How are they keeping you there? How are they making you madder? How are they making you more anxious? How are they making you sadder?
Okay, so really you're talking about advertisers and content providers keeping your attention for as long as they can, and perhaps with stronger and stronger content as they go, building on what you've shown as your areas of interest. And I mean, if you look at what we talked about at the very start of this, the millions of interactions have been even since this conversation started. And it just gives an idea of the sheer scale of all this, I suppose, what you could call manipulating or maneuvering or not. I suppose that's what's up for grabs to talk about in some ways today. And I think related to that then is the algorithms used in these choice architectures and these different channels. And I'm going to ask you, Stephen, just to maybe explain a bit how that works, because it could help us understand how information is being fed to us, and maybe we don't always realise how it is being curated on our behalf, whether we choose to have it curated or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again the big context here and the important thing to understand is that the internet is actually a highly regulated space. Every time you go online, what you see is not your choice necessarily on its own. It is regulated by algorithms, so-called algorithms that are based on sometimes on artificial intelligence that the platforms are using to decide what information to display, what information to show you. So every time you do a Google search, the result is curated by an algorithm. And that's absolutely necessary. There's nothing wrong with that per se, because without algorithms, you couldn't find anything on the internet because there's just way too much information out there. So if I want to find information, I have to Google it or use another search engine, and they have to have an algorithm to decide what to show me. So, for example, if I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I'm Googling Newcastle, then it probably makes sense that I get information about the city in Australia that's just 2 hours down the road rather than Newcastle in northern England. And that is the type of thing that these algorithms sort of take into consideration. And that's wonderful, and that is satisfying, our needs, and it works very well. But like all things, it comes with a dark side. And the dark side is that the same algorithms are also involved in recommending things to you, as Jane has already said. If you're on YouTube and you finish watching a video, then the next one will start automatically. You can disable that with difficulty, but by default, it'll play you another video. Where does that video come from? Well, it comes from a recommender system that is based on artificial intelligence and that is, in addition, sensitive to your personal preferences. And it'll show you videos that it thinks are of interest to you. Now, again, that can work really well. And, whenever I go to Amazon and buy a book, I'm always impressed at all the other books I'm supposed to buy that they recommend to me because they're all interesting and they all, tap my interests, and Amazon knows that. But back to YouTube, one of the things that we know is that you can become radicalized, or you can at least be exposed to radical and extremist content on YouTube through the recommender system alone. So one of my PhD students just last week finished a paper on this issue. He looked at the entire literature out there on that. And the evidence is now pretty strong that you can start out with fairly innocuous search terms on YouTube. You watch a video on that, and after a remarkably quick series of steps, you're ending up with radical right wing, Islamophobic, or Islamist content. It can happen very easily. And moreover, once you're in that radical or extremist bubble, the recommender system will not give you a hint to get out of it. Quite on the contrary, it'll keep feeding you, as Jane already said, things you've seen before. And that is potentially problematic. And there's anecdotal evidence that YouTube has radicalized people in the United States. And in fact, we know that Facebook was quite aware of the fact that its algorithms were polarizing the American public. And they also would have known what to do about that. But they chose not to do that because they were worried that that would disrupt their business model. In other words, that they'd make less money. So we now have corporations that are basically regulating the internet through algorithms without public accountability.
Okay, so that's a very clear issue identified in the report. Do you have any comment on that yourself, Jane, just with sort of this lack of regulation of algorithms?
Yeah, no, I think it's hugely problematic. So basically, it's around everybody, well, not everybody, but the European Union and to some extent Congress in Washington are looking at, how you could start to regulate the social media platforms. And of course, what they say is that they are that they're simply publishers. So, or not, they're not publishers, they're simply platforms. So they kind of tried to liken themselves, or until recently, more as the kind of the aircom or the telecom errand. They're literally just providing the kind of the wires through which all this information comes across people's desks. And more recently, they've started taking more action, started to take things down if they're problematic. But of course, there's so much content that doesn't happen very well. I was just looking at a presentation from a master's student just an hour and a half ago about all of the fake stories on Irish Facebook about COVID, and some of them that had even been fact checked, and they were still circulating in some of the really big groups on Facebook in Ireland, which are exposed to conspiracy theories and so on about COVID, even though they've been fact checked. So the platforms just don't, and maybe can't even get rid of all of this with the way that their model works, with this kind of advertising based model that Stephen, has set out, with this need to keep attention. So probably at the end of the day, what needs to happen is actually a change of that advertising model. There needs to need to think about how that works, and the only way that's going to change, because it makes so much money. All of the money that used to go to advertisers, to the Sligo Champion or the Irish Independent or the Farmers Journal, their ad revenue has dried up, and it's going to Facebook and Google. So, the only way that this is going to happen is through some sort of regulation about what these algorithms are actually doing. And, just a much greater realization as well on the part of people that when they open up their Facebook, or when they go onto YouTube, or when they open up their Insta, they're not choosing what they're seeing. It's the algorithm is choosing what they're seeing. And, so there's some moves, even in Dáil Éireann, about some regulation to tackle this, but really it's something that's going to happen, most likely at European level. Stephen can talk to you more about this, but I think most of the world is kind of looking to Europe to really make the first move. There have been some in Australia, but to really have a global impact, it's going to have to be a player of the size of the European Union to really make a difference to it.
Okay, so you've both used some very interesting phrases there, talking about publishing and platform. And I suppose just even to go back to your comparison with the Sligo Champion, or even just, with printed media, where you have your traditional publishing, whereas on a platform, like you say, you open up your phone or you log into something, you don't know what's coming. Whereas more traditionally, you're choosing what newspaper you open, what book you open, and you're choosing what information you want to see. So I suppose leading then into the fourth pressure point that's mentioned in this report, the conversation around misinformation and disinformation. There just seem to be so many different types and classifications of information there: good, bad, indifferent, right, wrong. Okay, some of it is a matter of opinion, but some of it is, like you were just saying, Jane, hasn't necessarily been fact checked, or has been fact checked and still circulates. Can you talk a little bit about the findings about misinformation and disinformation in the report, please, Stephen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, connecting to what Jane was saying about this issue of platforms versus being a publisher, that in fact is incredibly interesting and important, because the platforms used to say, "Oh, well, we're not publishing anything; it's other people who do. Our users do that, and we wouldn't be able to spot misinformation anyhow." That was sort of Facebook's line for many years. Number one, we're not responsible. Number two, we're helpless. There's nothing we can do. Now, the COVID pandemic has revealed both of those claims to be incorrect, because what Facebook was able to do very quickly is to identify misinformation about COVID and to either take it down or to make it much harder to access by putting an opaque mask on top of the content with a warning, which people, which discouraged people to access the content. Now, I'll say more about that in a moment, but the interesting thing to take note of is that all of a sudden Facebook had no difficulty identifying misinformation, and they take responsibility as the publisher, which is what they are, in my opinion, by responding to that malign content. So we're now in a situation where we know that the platforms are capable of responding to the information that's out there. They take responsibility for it. And of course, in a democracy, we can pass laws that tell the platforms, by the way, are responsible. So that opens up the door to deal with this issue. And the question then becomes, well, how are we going to deal with it? Now, let me go back to what I just said about putting a mask on top of bad content, because it turns out when Facebook did that, they reduced access to that misinformation based on their own experiments by 5% in comparison to other users that didn't get the mask. So it was a highly effective way of discouraging access to that information. And it didn't really involve censorship because the content was available. It was just much harder to get to it. The user had to click through the warnings. Now, that process collectively is friction, introducing friction to make it harder for people to access content online. And the data suggests that that is extremely successful, that by making it harder to get to, you can use reliance on misinformation without censorship because you're never removing content. Now, there are other situations where maybe you do have to remove content, and YouTube has done that this past 12 months as well. They have removed a lot of conspiracy-based videos related to the COVID pandemic, and that also has been successful, although arguably that involves censorship because the video disappeared. But interestingly, it wasn't the case that people just went elsewhere to see the same information. In fact, what happened was that public interest in that decline. Look at Google. These things work. We can deal with misinformation. That.
Okay, so you've given us examples there. Stephen, sorry, we lost you there. I'm going to move on. You've given us examples of misinformation, disinformation in the context of that. We will come back to you on that, but I'm going to move on. I think we'll be coming after that point as well. Is asking Jane just about this report. We sort of looked at those 4 different pressure points, and the report looks at taking democracy online. What are the risks around this, and what are the potential positives out of that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. You know what I mean? There's lots, and it really is a tale of 2 very different things. If you look at, when the internet and especially social media first started, people were really optimistic, and they were thinking, this is going to be fantastic. It's a way for people to network with people in other worlds, in other countries. It's a way to build communities. It's a way to bring kind of social movements. So you have this whole kind of, there was the hope around the Arab Spring, for example, that, all of those people across the Middle East were able to kind of build and protest. And we still see some of this, so we still see like big movements that have come out of it. Look at Black Lives Matter. And the extent that Black Lives Matter like really took off in the US, and perhaps made a difference in the last election, or in terms of the everything for the women's movement, the whole kind of Me Too movement, and those kind of hashtags and everything, or Fridays for Future. Can you imagine Greta Thunberg and the difference she would have made in a world before social media? It just would not have traveled in the same way if we were just relying on, RTE to kind of give us the odd report on the Friday evening news and our local newspapers to pick it up. So there is this kind of enormous potential for connecting people, people with the same kind of interest, people wanting to change things and so on. So you've got that on one side. But then you have on the other side its potential for giving rise to extremism and to radicalism. We saw how, I have a colleague, Maura Conway in DCU, who looks at, how terrorist groups use online in order to build their following. So we saw, the poor teenagers in England, the teenage girls leaving to join ISIS as kind of jihadi brides and so on. So, and the awful beheadings and, absolutely dreadful things. So, part of this kind of negative part of the internet that Steve and I have just talked about so far today, can really drive people down these kind of extremist kind of narratives. It can really push people into more extreme places. So what we need to think about is there a way of reclaiming the internet and reclaiming social media that actually does good for democracy? The Congress in the US has heard about how overall many people believe that Facebook has actually been bad for democracy overall because of this kind of pushing of different stories and that aren't true, and there's lack of fact checking, and but now we're beginning to see hope again, as Stephen said. The COVID pandemic has taught us that action can be taken. There is stuff on fact checking. People are doing more about media literacy. So I think it has to be a two-sided thing. On the one hand, if we're thinking about, the potential for democracy, we have to do much more to tackle the negative, tackle the tendency of social media to push people towards extremism, push them towards radicalism, push them into believing the wildest of conspiracy theories, and then try to harness its benefits, the ability to build groups and things. And then I think one of the interesting things is now we're trying to look at, so for example, Ireland has been really good at this in the past, at the kind of the building of what's called deliberative democracy. So that would be the citizens' assemblies that were held before the kind of the marriage equality referendums, or the referendum on the 8th and so on, which brought people together and got them to listen. So it's not just about kind of spouting your own views, it's about listening to others, it's about trying to respond in a way that you're responding with evidence and so on. And there's more and more parts of the internet that are beginning to move a little bit in this direction. You see some of them that are outside of the platforms like Reddit that can go one way or the other, but there's more and more platforms now. And again, with COVID, there's been, because we're all living our lives so much more online, there's been so much more work done around this. We couldn't have had this seminar with Sligo Libraries 2 years ago using this platform and using Zoom and everything. So all of these technologies, which enable us to think about things, to think about evidence, to listen to other people, are all building all the time. So there is this great potential, but it's really difficult to harness because there is this huge pressure on the other side, on the negative side. So I think if we try to focus on building the potential for democratic movements, building the potential to listen, building the potential for people to start thinking about, do they have evidence for their views? So we have one project, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, where we're trying to think about, how do we encourage people to really engage with social media. It's called Provenance. We're running it in DCU. And what we're trying to do is see what kind of nudges can we put in on people's social media feeds that just make them stop and think for a moment. Why am I seeing this in my feed? I'm feeling cross. Why is it trying to make me cross? And, just stopping and thinking about that before they like and share things. So I think it's a kind of a two-sided thing. We have to try to stop the negative impacts and then try to increase the positive ones.
Definitely, Jane, you're making a very clear point there about, I suppose, there being two sides to the internet. There is, it's a huge way of connecting people, and that can be both positive or negative depending on the context. But just to pick up on one thing you're saying there, how we almost retrain ourselves, or could I say even grow up in how we deal with the internet and how we interact with it. And what you're saying there, to me, seems to be saying that rather than be a passive consumer of all things online, that we're more active or more engaged and we question. And I think it's fair to say that we are starting to do that. But like you say, it's a huge body of information, of campaign, of interaction, of work, of connection. And, there really needs to be a firm policy put in place. And we've already mentioned that one country can't do it alone. It's an international, it's a it's a whole world institution, for want of a better word. So really the policy has to come from large organizations such as the EU. So I'm going to ask you, Jane, first, and then move to Steve. What does this report and these issues that you've raised, what do they mean for future policy and practice in looking at, how information is dealt with and how it's delivered and how it's disseminated in the context of democracy?
Yeah, I think it's the report, and like so much kudos to, like, I reviewed it, but I wasn't involved in writing it, to Stephen and all his colleagues in the JRC and across academia across Europe for bringing this together, because I think it was really important and a valuable contribution. And there's conversations happening all the time at a European level about this. And these are feeding through, like, obviously when things come into European legislation, we'll have to enact them in Ireland. But even at the moment, there's a bill. The heads of the bill were just published a couple of weeks ago about online harms. And there's kind of a movement. People are trying to encourage their TDs. Well, why is disinformation not in this bill? Why is it not considered an online harm? So it just seems like something that somebody has forgotten to put in. So we're really hoping that that is addressed, because at the moment the online harms in the new bill that's meant to come into play in Ireland in 2021 are based around things like hate speech and anorexia and this kind of thing, which are obviously big problems and big online harms. But the whole clouding of the information environment, the whole thing where people are no longer sure what's true, what isn't, where there aren't clear ways to report disinformation. This new bill, which is going to set up a new media regulator, it's going to be replacing the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Like, I think it's really crucial that from an Irish perspective, that is included in that bill. So I think anybody on this webinar who's interested in this or is interested in following up and in protecting themselves, their community, their children, their parents. I think an important thing here actually is just very quick divergence is the thing about people's parents. The research shows that grandparents are among the most likely people to share disinformation because they have lower levels of digital literacy. So a lot of our attention goes on teenagers and putting programs into primary schools, and these are great and they're important. But I think it's really important, and it's vital, that the libraries are doing so much because they're really kind of intergenerational, that there would be programs held about information literacy for older people. So I think that's important. I think this seminar is really important that people get to see that. And then I think it's important that people bring it back in their own communities, this importance of being aware. And then finally, if you are engaging with policymakers, ask them, why is this not in the new media bill? Why is the new media regulator not going to be looking after disinformation? Can you please ask your parties to try to get this included in the new bill?
Okay, thanks, Jane. A very sort of salient point for me, it really struck me when you're talking about information literacy. I tend to think about, internet skills, and whether it's people my age or older people, younger people, how they use their various different social medias. But the idea of information literacy, how you disseminate that and how you identify, what's true to what you need or what you're looking for is really, really important. Stefan, I'm not sure how your connection is there. Just wondering, do you have any comment on sort of policy and future practice in the context of this report? No, I'm going to come back to Stefan. We'll just give him a couple of minutes. We're coming, I suppose, to the end of our conversation now. And what I really want to ask both of you is, based on the discussions we've had, there's lots of food for thought about, how you engage with information, how you share it, how you put it out there. Are you a platform information provider? Are you a publisher? Lots of different questions. And looking also from a local, national, and international point of view, what sort of legislation is needed? What sort of good practices needed, both as individuals and also at a much higher level, at a government level and at an EU level? So I'm just going to ask you, I'll go back. Actually, Steph, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I seem to
Okay,
have
great.
some connection.
Stefan, I'm just going to ask you, do you have any final comments that you'd like to make in the context of the report that we've discussed today, just from the point of view of people using the internet to get information, and especially in the context of democracy and fair ideas and fair speech for all? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I think ultimately the responsibility is with the platforms and policymakers and our, representatives in government to resolve this problem. But there are also things that we can do as individuals, and I think Jane already hinted at that. For example, if you go online and you get really, really angry at something you've read, well, take that as a signal that perhaps somebody is trying to, play with your emotion. Not necessarily, but quite possibly. Now, together with colleagues, I've run a series of experiments on these little hints that we can give people to identify when they're being manipulated. And that actually turns out to work generally quite well, especially telling people that, if you're highly emotive about something, then think again whether somebody might be pulling your strings. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is you can learn something called lateral reading, which is quite interesting because what it means is that to assess the credibility of a source, you don't spend time looking at the source itself. If you come across some website and you don't know if it's dodgy or not, well, don't waste your time on that website. Open a few more tabs, go somewhere else and Google the website and see what other people say about it. And it turns out that we can teach high school students to do this in about 20 minutes. And they then become very, very clever at identifying dodgy websites. For example, websites that are funded by the fossil fuel industry but purport to give you information about climate change. Well, they don't. They're misleading you. And it's easier to find out by going elsewhere rather than the website itself. And that's a simple trick that you can learn in 5 minutes. And that makes a difference to the accuracy of the information you're going to consume.
Thanks. So what you're saying is when you react to something online, think about why you're reacting and just analyze it a bit before you actually take action on it. And what I'm hearing as well is shop around. Don't look for all your information on one website. Have a look around and get other opinions and perspectives. Jane, do you have any final comments just following on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's, so that's pretty much what we're saying. So Stephen has done some really cool work on that. But I think it's not just shop around. It's, if a particular post is making you really cross or really anxious, actually think, well, where does that come from? And Google them and just see, like maybe other people are saying, well, actually, these are a really dodgy website that are just there as part of it. So that was kind of the lateral thinking there that Stephen was talking about. And it's really powerful. We did an experiment where we compared our there's teenagers who come into DCU for kind of classes who are between the ages of 12 and 16 with some of our master's students. And we actually found the 12 to 16-year-olds were much better at just kind of, Googling and having a think and trying to think where things came from. Whereas by the time people even got into their early 20s, they'd already developed habits of, oh, there's an expert there, so it must be okay. Somebody has come from the Institute of Gobbledygook. This must mean it's okay. So they actually started to believe that the false websites put up by fossil fuel industry denying climate science, that maybe there was actually some science behind it, whereas the teenagers were really smart at thinking around that. So I think it's just trying to think about that. I think information literacy, the older you go and the more libraries can do about that, absolutely the better. My mother's done all sorts of courses on how to use her phone in our local library. but she hasn't done a course. She still rings me up when she gets one of those texts looking for her bank number. You know what I mean? So she needs more on that kind of thing.
Okay, so very clear message from both of you there today to look at how we read information, how we listen to information, to stop and think when we're looking at something on the internet and not to be, I suppose, a passive consumer of the internet and just to question all the time. That's the clear message I'm certainly taking away from it. And I know the next time I log in, hopefully, I will be looking at things a little bit differently, or maybe just having a little question mark in the back of my head all the time, asking myself, is this true? Am I sure of this? Why do I feel this way? Where can I find out more information? What do other people think? So that's the message I'm going to leave you all with today. And I want to thank very, very much, to say thank you to Stefan and to Jane, our two speakers today, coming from DCU and coming from Brussels. Stay safe, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.